The air in the Valley of the Kings is thick with silence, and with the weight of thousands of years. On February 16th, 1923, that silence was shattered. After years of searching, archaeologist Howard Carter stood before a sealed doorway, the entrance to the burial chamber of a boy king who had rested, undisturbed for over 3,000 years, Tutankhamun. His sponsor, Lord Carnarvon, stood anxiously at his side, asking, "Can you see anything?" Carter, peering through a small hole with a candle, was speechless. The flickering light danced across a stunning spectacle of gold. "Yes," he finally managed to say, "wonderful things." But what they couldn't see, what no one could see, was the legend that was about to be born. A legend not of gold or history, but of death. Within weeks of the chamber's opening, Lord Carnarvon was dead. A mosquito bite on his cheek, nicked while shaving, became lethally infected. On the very night he died, a massive power outage plunged Cairo into darkness. Back in England, Carnarvon's dog Susie let out a howl and dropped dead. The story was irresistible. A deadly curse, unleashed from the Pharaoh's tomb, was claiming its first victim. The world became obsessed. But what if I told you that the whole idea of the Pharaoh's curse, the very concept that has fueled a century of horror movies and ghost stories, is almost entirely a modern invention? What if the truth of what ancient Egyptians actually carved into their tomb walls is far more surprising and infinitely more fascinating than any curse? The birth of a legend, the story of the Pharaoh's curse, isn't really a story about ancient Egypt. It's a story about the early 20th century. It's a tale of ambition, media sensationalism, and a public absolutely desperate for a good mystery. Before Howard Carter ever laid eyes on Tutankhamun's tomb, the idea of cursed mummies was already brewing in Western fiction, a product of Victorian fascination with spiritualism and the exotic, mysterious East. But the discovery of this particular tomb created the perfect storm, transforming a niche horror trope into a global phenomenon. The main character in this drama was, of course, Lord Carnarvon. His death lit the fuse. He died just 6 weeks after the burial chamber was unsealed from blood poisoning that led to pneumonia. For the newspapers of the day, a simple, tragic medical event just wasn't a good enough story. Not when a far more tantalizing narrative was right there for the taking. The press went into a frenzy. They needed a hook, and the curse was perfect. And then, some of the most famous figures of the era threw gasoline on the fire. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of the hyper-rational Sherlock Holmes, was ironically a passionate believer in spiritualism. He publicly suggested that Carnarvon's death wasn't caused by a mosquito, but by elementals or evil spirits created by Egyptian priests to guard the tomb. His words carried huge weight, lending a kind of intellectual credibility to the supernatural theory. Then there was the best-selling novelist Marie Corelli, who, just a month after the tomb was opened, wrote a dramatic letter to a magazine quoting an ancient, and probably fake, text that warned of dire punishment for any intruder. It was spooky, it was thrilling, and it sold newspapers. The media built the narrative, piece by piece. The power cut in Cairo? A sign from the Pharaoh. His dog dying in England? Proof of the curse's long reach. Soon, every death even loosely connected to the excavation was added to the curse's list of victims. Prince Ali Kamal Fahmy Bey was shot by his wife in 1923. He'd visited the tomb, so it must have been the curse. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, who supposedly X-rayed the mummy, died in 1924. Another victim, Arthur Mace, a member of Carter's team, died in 1928. Howard Carter's secretary was found smothered in his bed in 1929. When you line it all up, it looks like a damning pattern. But that's the power of confirmation bias. The story was already written. The curse is real. All journalists and the public had to do was fit the events into it. They ignored the context. Lord Carnarvon was already in poor health. The other deaths, spread out over nearly a decade, were due to a variety of unconnected causes: murder, suicide, and pre-existing illness. They weren't mysterious, but the story was better if they were. Some sources even suggest Howard Carter himself quietly fanned the flames, seeing the rumors as a handy way to keep crowds of tourists and reporters away from the delicate archaeological site. A legend had been born, not from an ancient scroll, but from the pages of the daily paper. The myth on trial, the hard evidence. So what happens when you put the legend on trial? When you step away from the sensational headlines and look at the cold, hard facts? The whole story, so carefully built by the media, collapses. Let's start with the most obvious question. What about the people who didn't die? If a Pharaoh's curse was real, its number one target should have been the man who led the whole operation, Howard Carter. Yet, Carter lived on for another 16 years, dying of lymphoma in 1939 at the age of 64. And what about Lord Carnarvon's daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert? She was one of the very first people to enter the sealed tomb with Carter. She lived for another 57 years, passing away in 1980. An American archaeologist, J.O. Kinnaman, another witness to the opening, survived until 1961. The truth is, the death toll of the curse was a statistical illusion. In 2002, the British Medical Journal, a publication not usually concerned with ancient spirits, decided to put the curse to the test. Researchers studied 44 Westerners who Carter identified as being in Egypt when the tomb was discovered. They compared the lifespans of the 25 people who were actually present at the opening of the tomb with those who weren't. The result was crystal clear. There was no significant difference in survival rates between the two groups. Those exposed to the supposed curse didn't die any younger than those who were not. The study concluded the curse was a myth, a product of people seeing patterns where none existed. But the most damning piece of evidence against the curse of King Tut is this: there was no curse. Not a single inscription threatening death to intruders was ever found in the tomb. The now famous line, "Death will strike with its two poisonous wings anyone who disturbs the peace of the king," is a complete fabrication. It appears nowhere in the tomb, and seems to have been invented later to sell the story. So where did the idea of a written threat come from? It was a classic case of media distortion. The only inscription that could possibly be twisted into a warning was on a clay brick. It was a common protective spell that read, "I am for the protection of the deceased." Another shrine to the god Anubis had a similar line. "It is I who hindered the sand from choking the secret chamber." By the time this was reported in the press, it had mysteriously grown a new, more sinister passage. "And I will kill all those who cross this threshold." From there, it wasn't a long leap for storytellers to invent the even more poetic Wings of Death version. The curse wasn't discovered. It was manufactured. The evidence is clear. The curse of King Tut was, as one Egyptologist bluntly called it, unadulterated claptrap. What did they actually write? So, if royal tombs weren't covered in threats of death and destruction, does that mean curse inscriptions are a complete myth? Not entirely. They did exist, but they were incredibly rare in the tombs of pharaohs. The real warnings are found mostly in private tombs from the Old Kingdom, and what they say is far more mundane, and in some ways more interesting than the Hollywood version. These weren't supernatural booby traps for tomb raiders. Their intended audience was often the Ka priests, the people hired to maintain the tomb and perform offering rituals for the dead person's spirit. The warnings were less about a magical hex and more like a legal threat, a reminder to do their jobs properly and keep the tomb ritually pure. For example, a famous inscription from the tomb of a 6th dynasty official named Kentika warns, "As for all men who shall enter this my tomb ... impure, there will be judgment, an end shall be made for him. I shall seize his neck like a bird." The imagery is violent, for sure, But the context is key. The threat is for someone entering in an impure state, a clear instruction to priests to perform the right purification rituals. It's about spiritual cleanliness, not just trespassing. Another fascinating example comes from the tomb of Antifi, a governor. His threat isn't about physical harm, but about social and divine ruin. It reads, "Any ruler who shall do evil or wickedness to this coffin, may Hemen, a local god, not accept any goods he offers, and may his heir not inherit." This is a curse aimed at a person's legacy. It threatens that their religious offerings will be rejected and that their own son won't inherit their titles and property. For an Egyptian noble, this was a devastating prospect, an attack on their entire social and spiritual future. Some curses were more direct. One from the tomb of Harkov states, "As for any man who shall enter into this tomb, I will seize him like a wild fowl. He shall be judged by the great God." Again, the threat is twofold. A physical consequence in this life, followed by a final judgment in the next. The fear wasn't just of death, but of what came after. But maybe the best inscription is one that shows the massive gap between myth and reality. A text found on a stone slab was meant to stop anyone from taking even a single pebble from the tomb. And what was the dire punishment for this crime? The inscription says the great gods of the underworld will reproach the violator very, 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 very much. To us, that's almost comically anticlimactic. But for an ancient Egyptian, being sternly judged and reproached by the gods was a terrifying thought. It wasn't about a dramatic death. It was about eternal dishonor. The real tomb security system. This brings us to the biggest question. If they knew how to write threatening warnings, why are they so rare in the tombs of the most powerful people in the land, the Pharaohs? Why didn't Ramesses the Great plaster his tomb with promises of death? The answer reveals something fundamental about how ancient Egyptians saw the world. To them, a written curse was basically redundant. In ancient Egypt, the tomb was a house of eternity. It was the launch pad for the soul's journey into the afterlife. Preserving the body through mummification and protecting the tomb were essential for ensuring the deceased could live on forever. So to desecrate a tomb wasn't just theft, it was spiritual murder. It was an act so profoundly sacrilegious that it carried its own built-in punishment, eternal damnation. The thief wouldn't just face justice in this life. They would be denied their own afterlife, their name erased from existence. There was no need to write this down. It was the most basic and terrifying religious belief of the culture. Pharaohs had much more practical security systems. First, physical security. Royal tombs in the New Kingdom were hidden in the desolate Valley of the Kings, a royal cemetery patrolled by elite guards called the Mege. Entrances were sealed, covered with rubble, and their locations were meant to be a state secret. The tombs themselves were architectural defenses, with long corridors, false doors, hidden chambers, and deep shafts designed to thwart robbers. The inscriptions that did cover the walls of royal tombs had a completely different purpose. They weren't warnings for thieves. They were a user's manual for the dead. Texts like the Book of the Dead and the Amduat were complex magical formulas, maps of the underworld, and collections of spells to help the pharaoh's soul navigate the dangerous journey to the afterlife. The words were protection for the king, not a threat to the living. The real security system was a combination of secrecy, guards, clever architecture, and the overwhelming fear of divine punishment that was woven into the very fabric of society. Science enters the tomb. While the supernatural curse has been thoroughly debunked, the legend has led scientists to ask a different, more interesting question. Could there be a natural explanation for the illnesses tied to opening ancient tombs? Could there be a real physical danger lurking inside? The most common theory involves tomb toxins. The idea is that a sealed tomb could be a perfect incubator for dangerous microbes. When the tomb is opened, dormant spores of potentially harmful fungi like Aspergillus flavus and Aspergillus niger, are released into the air and can be inhaled. For someone with a weak immune system, like the already ill Lord Carnarvon inhaling, these spores could trigger a severe respiratory infection. A more startling theory involves something that sounds like science fiction: radiation. Some researchers have proposed that the deaths could be explained by radiation exposure. The granite used in many tombs, as well as the surrounding rock in the Valley of the Kings, can contain natural deposits of uranium. Over thousands of years in a sealed space, this uranium decays, releasing radon and radioactive gas. Studies have measured significant levels of radon in some Egyptian tombs. This kind of exposure wouldn't cause a sudden, dramatic death, but could lead to slow, insidious illnesses like cancer, developing years after exposure, a disease that no doctor can diagnose, as one supposed curse text eerily put it. This has led some to speculate that the ancients may have been aware of a lingering danger in these places, a warning not of a supernatural curse, but of a very real earthly poison. So what do you think? Was the legend of the curse just a media frenzy? Or could there be a scientific basis to the stories? Let us know your theories in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by the intersection of myth and history, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the past. In the end, the question, why were so many pharaohs buried with curses, starts from a false premise. They weren't. The deadly Pharaoh's curse is a modern ghost story, a myth born from our own fascination with death, mystery, and ancient Egypt. The historical reality is that Egyptians relied on secrecy, security, and a deeply held belief in divine punishment to protect their dead. The words they carved on tomb walls were not for us, but for the soul's perilous journey into eternity. But science has added an incredible final twist. In a development from June 2025, scientists have been studying the very fungus once blamed for the curse, Aspergillus flavus. They have discovered it produces a class of molecules called asparagomycins, which have shown powerful anti-cancer properties and are highly effective against leukemia cells in lab tests. In the most unbelievable of ironies, the substance once feared as the instrument of a pharaoh's fatal curse might one day provide us with a life-saving cure. The tombs of ancient Egypt, it seems, haven't given up all their secrets just yet.